The night was soaked in silence, yet it was not the silence of peace but the kind that trembled with unseen violence. The valley lay shrouded under the heavy breath of the moon, silver light cutting across broken ridges and dying trees that had once been green but now stood like charred bones. Deep in the shadows moved a figure who seemed less man and more ghost, a phantom wrapped in black, his steps soundless against the stone and dirt. Soldiers had given him a name that spread faster than fire across the front lines. To some he was a nightmare, to others a savior, but to the enemy he was whispered as death's angel, the one who arrived unseen and left behind nothing but silence and surrender. His true name was buried in the dust of forgotten records, for the battlefield did not remember names, it remembered fear. And fear was what followed him like a shadow. He had wandered into the war with no banners, no allegiance carved in stone, only a heart that carried its own weight of scars and a vow to protect those who could not stand against the tide. He moved like the wind among hills and trenches, and when his blade struck, no echo of life remained. The enemy had learned to dread the flicker of movement that came when the moon hid behind clouds, because that was when he descended. And on this particular night, fate was setting the stage for a legend that would be carved into memory not by the roar of cannons but by the silence of 200 hearts bowing to one man. The enemy camp lay stretched across the low ground of the valley, fires burning with arrogant confidence, voices rising in drunken laughter, for they believed they owned the night. Their commanders had spoken of an easy dawn, of crushing the remnants of resistance, of burying the last defenders beneath steel and ash. Yet among their ranks, whispers had already begun, rumors that an unseen figure had haunted nearby posts. Entire squads had gone missing without a cry, patrols had returned with eyes wide and voices trembling, speaking of a shadow that moved like smoke and struck with hands swifter than gunfire. The officers dismissed these fears as cowardice, but the common soldier, whose nights were long and restless, believed every word. And tonight, as they feasted and sharpened blades, they did not know that the phantom they feared was already among them, watching from the ridgeline, eyes colder than the steel he carried. He studied them not with hatred but with a stillness that spoke of calculation, and in his silence was a kind of judgment. His approach was not loud, not rushed, but deliberate, as though every step was a verse in a poem of war that only he could recite. He slipped past the outer guards, who slumped half awake against their rifles, their breaths heavy with drink, and before their eyes could widen, they sank into the dark with no sound. He was a shadow among shadows, his hands steady, his blade whispering as it drank the night air. The camp was alive with careless voices, but he walked through it as though it belonged to him, unseen, untouchable, inevitable. A soldier turned, sensing something unnatural in the rhythm of the night, but by the time he looked, there was only silence and the sudden weight of his own fear pressing on his chest. Death's angel moved like a sculptor carving terror out of stillness, and the camp began to bend beneath his presence. He could have killed them all, but death was not always the weapon he chose. Fear was sharper, more enduring, and tonight he intended to wield it until the hearts of 200 men trembled to the edge of surrender. He struck at the fires first, snuffing their warmth, plunging patches of the camp into darkness, until soldiers began to whisper and shuffle uneasily. Then he took their banners, tearing them from poles and casting them into the mud, a silent declaration that the night belonged to him. Every act was a message, every shadow carried his name, and slowly the laughter that had filled the valley thinned into uneasy murmurs. The officers shouted commands demanding order, but their words were hollow against the pressure that weighed on every chest. For somewhere in the dark, unseen eyes watched, and every soldier knew that if he stood too tall or spoke too loudly, he might be the next to vanish. By the time the first shot cracked the silence, the camp was already unraveling. A soldier had fired at nothing, his nerves snapping under the weight of fear, and suddenly rifles flared as men shot at shadows, their own terror feeding chaos. Through the smoke he moved, weaving between panic and gunfire, untouched, unbroken, his figure glimpsed only for a breath before fading again. It was enough. The image of him, pale against the firelight, black against the night, was more powerful than any weapon. He had become not a man but an omen, and when men fight against omens, their courage drains faster than blood. As dawn threatened on the horizon, the camp was no longer an army but a trembling mass of men clutching rifles they no longer believed in. Their commanders had fallen silent, stripped of authority by the invisible noose tightening around them. And when he finally stepped into the open, calm, unhurried, standing where every eye could see, the weight of their fear collapsed into surrender. 200 rifles were lowered, 200 voices quieted, and without a single shout, the battlefield belonged to him. They called him Death's Angel not because he killed without mercy, but because he carried the presence of death itself, and men who looked into his eyes realized there was no fight left in them. The valley carried a strange silence after the surrender, a silence so heavy that even the rising wind seemed afraid to disturb it. 200 men stood with lowered weapons, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure who had broken their will without shouting a command or firing a volley. Some trembled, some stared blankly, and others clenched their jaws as though ashamed, but none moved against him. He walked through them slowly, his presence steady and deliberate, and they parted before him as if he were not flesh and blood but something older, something beyond comprehension. Their officers, once proud with polished boots and heavy voices, now looked like children stripped of authority, unable to meet his gaze. He did not speak immediately, for words were not his weapon. Instead, he studied them as though measuring the weight of their souls, and the quiet stretched until every breath in the camp seemed loud. Finally, his voice came, low and sharp, carrying not the tone of anger but of absolute certainty. He told them that war was nothing but a graveyard waiting to be filled, that men who fought for greed or empty orders had already died long before their bodies fell. His words cut deeper than any blade, and though simple, they wrapped around the hearts of his captives like chains. The dawn light crept across the valley, illuminating the wreckage of their arrogance. Fires smoldered in silence, broken banners lay in mud, and the mountain ridges stood like ancient witnesses to what had transpired. The figure, still known only as Death's Angel, did not gloat, did not boast, for victory was never his desire. His mission was survival, his vow was justice, and his soul had no patience for glory. He looked at the men before him and saw not enemies but lost brothers driven into the teeth of war by voices far away from the battlefield. He released them not with mercy but with command, telling them to go back and carry the message of what they had seen. Their rifles he shattered against stone, their pride he stripped with silence, but their lives he left intact, for living with the weight of defeat was a sharper punishment than death. And so they left, 200 men walking not as soldiers but as shadows of themselves, their footsteps heavy, their heads bowed, and among them spread a tale that would burn through every camp and city touched by the war. Yet the man they called Death's Angel did not rest. For him, surrender was only the beginning. He knew the war was a beast with 1,000 heads, and cutting one only made another rise. Already, deeper in the mountains, other battalions gathered, swelling with weapons and cruelty, prepared to devour villages that clung to life among the rocks and streams. Innocents, women who carried water in cracked clay pots, children who still dreamed of a world without guns, old men who remembered seasons before blood tainted the soil, all of them stood in the path of armies that cared nothing for them. And so he walked on, leaving behind the valley and its ghosts, his figure blending once more with ridges and shadows. His body carried scars, some fresh, some old, yet his spirit moved like steel unbroken by time. He had no map, no orders, no commander but his own conscience, and it was that conscience that drove him deeper into the storm. The mountains welcomed him as though they knew his footsteps, the trees bending with the wind to hide his path, rivers whispering like old allies. He found himself among villagers who had heard of him not as a man but as a legend, a phantom who fought where armies could not. When they saw him, their eyes widened with awe and fear, for they did not know if he was human or spirit. Yet when he spoke, his words carried warmth they did not expect. He told them to guard their homes, to stay united, for division was the weapon of tyrants. He trained their young men not in the art of glory but in the art of survival, teaching them how to move unseen, how to strike only when necessary, how to remember that the land was their shield and their blood should not be wasted for empty promises. He gave them courage, but he did not bind them to him, for he knew that every soul had to choose its own path. As days turned to weeks, rumors grew like wildfire. Armies on the march began to whisper before setting camp, their captains hearing stories of 200 men who laid down arms before a single figure. Fear crept into their bones even before battle, and in their fear they hesitated. The shadow of Death's Angel stretched wider than his footsteps, touching corners of the war he had not even seen. His enemies tried to dismiss the tales, calling them lies, yet every soldier who had been in the valley swore with trembling voice that they had seen him, that he was real, that death itself walked beside him. The legend no longer belonged to him, it belonged to the war, a fire feeding on the imagination of both friend and foe. But legends are not without price. As his name spread, so too did the danger. Commanders placed bounties on his head, hunters were sent into the hills, spies tracked every village where whispers arose. Armies no longer feared each other as much as they feared him, and this fear drove them into greater cruelty, burning homes in the hope of smoking him out, slaughtering innocents to break the spirit of those who might shelter him. He carried this weight like a cloak of fire, knowing that every life lost in pursuit of him was a wound upon his soul. Still he pressed on because turning back was a betrayal of every child whose eyes had begged him for protection. Night after night, he walked into battles not of his choosing but of necessity. He struck like thunder, vanished like mist, and where he moved resistance found strength. Villages rose against their oppressors, soldiers deserted their cruel masters, and the land itself seemed to breathe with new defiance. Yet in the quiet of his solitude, when no eyes watched, he wondered how long he could carry such a burden. For a man may become a legend, but a legend cannot weep, and though his heart longed for rest, rest had no place in the path he had chosen. He was death's angel not because he wished to be, but because war demanded it, and until the beast was slain or he was broken, his shadow would never leave the battlefield. The moon returned to the sky as if it had been waiting to witness his journey, a pale witness to the steps of a man who carried a war on his shoulders. The mountains stretched endlessly, their shadows falling like dark curtains across the valleys, and the figure walked among them with the silence of one who had long forgotten what it meant to rest. His path was uncertain, yet his purpose was carved into every scar that lined his body. The stories of Death's angel had traveled faster than the wind, reaching both the ears of frightened soldiers and the hearts of hopeful villagers. But for the man behind the legend, these stories were chains as much as they were wings. Each tale added to his burden, each whisper demanded more than his weary bones could carry, and yet he pressed forward, because the war left no place for hesitation. One night, as he approached a village hidden deep within the folds of the hills, he saw smoke curling against the stars. His steps quickened, his pulse steady but heavy, and when he reached the outskirts, he found the homes already broken, the earth scarred with fire. The villagers lay scattered, some clinging to life, others gone beyond return, their faces turned upward as if asking the heavens why justice was always late. His jaw tightened, his hand curled around his blade, but anger was not his master. He knelt beside a wounded boy whose chest rose and fell like a broken drumbeat, and though words could not heal the wound, his presence alone steadied the child's fear. Around him, survivors gathered, their eyes hollow with grief but burning with something else, an unspoken plea for vengeance, for hope, for anything that might remind them that they were not yet forgotten by the world. And so he rose, and with the calmness of stone, he promised them not revenge but protection. The raiders who had struck the village were no wandering bandits but soldiers under orders, driven by commanders desperate to crush any spark of defiance. Their camp was not far, their banners still visible from the hilltops, their fires glowing like arrogant eyes in the dark. He did not charge at them with rage, instead he studied their rhythm, their patrols, their carelessness born from confidence. For 3 nights he watched, never sleeping, a predator circling its prey. On the 4th night he moved. The forest seemed to bend around him, branches shielding his passage, earth softening beneath his steps. He dismantled them piece by piece, snuffing their fires, scattering their supplies, vanishing their sentries into silence. Panic grew among the soldiers like a disease, spreading faster than commands could control, and by dawn, what had been an army was little more than a terrified mob. Some fled, others surrendered, and a few tried to stand against him only to fall into the dust. He left the survivors alive, but with their weapons shattered and their spirits broken, so that when they stumbled back to their masters, their trembling voices carried his legend further than any blade could reach. The villagers watched from the hills as the enemy melted away, and when he returned, they greeted him not with cheers but with solemn gratitude, as though they knew victory was borrowed, not owned. He helped them rebuild what little they had, carrying timber with his scarred hands, fetching water from the streams, silent in his labor. For him, battle was easier than healing, for healing demanded patience, and patience was harder to hold than steel. Yet as he worked among them, the children began to follow him, their laughter fragile but real, their eyes seeing not a phantom but a protector. For a moment, beneath the broken sky, he almost felt human again. But the war did not pause for humanity. Scouts brought word that entire regiments were moving toward the mountains, hundreds strong, their commanders enraged by tales of 200 men surrendering, by villages that rose instead of bowing, by the growing fire that whispered the name Death's Angel. This army was no careless band, but a disciplined force armed with steel and fire, determined to crush both the legend and the man behind it. The villagers begged him to flee, to vanish into the mountains, for they knew no single figure, no matter how feared, could stand against such numbers. Yet he shook his head, his silence louder than any refusal, and began to prepare. He taught the villagers to set traps along the mountain paths, to use the rocks and rivers as their allies, to fight not with brute force but with patience and cunning. He placed the oldest and youngest in hidden shelters, ensuring that even if the village fell, its bloodline would not. And then he stood at the edge of the ridge, watching as the enemy banners appeared on the horizon, stretching like a tide of fire across the land. His body ached, his spirit weighed heavy, yet his eyes burned with the same calm flame that had made 200 men lower their weapons. The clash came with thunder. Cannons roared, rifles spat fire, voices screamed across the valley, but amid the storm moved a figure who belonged to no army, who fought not for crowns or coins but for the breath of those who had no one else to defend them. He struck and vanished, appeared and vanished again, weaving through smoke and blood as though the battlefield itself bent to his will. To the soldiers who faced him, he was not a man but a force, a shadow among fire, and their courage faltered before their weapons could even find their mark. Yet even as he cut through their ranks, he knew the price was climbing, that every strike demanded more of his strength, that legends could inspire but could not shield flesh from exhaustion. Still he did not falter. For behind him stood the remnants of a village that had placed its fragile hope in his hands, and hope, once carried, could not be set down. The valley burned with the fury of war, smoke twisting into the sky like the breath of demons, the air thick with the iron taste of blood and gunpowder. The enemy pressed forward with disciplined waves, their boots pounding the earth like drums of conquest, their rifles flashing with fire that carved the night into jagged fragments. Yet within this storm, one figure moved against the tide, his presence scattering certainty, his silence louder than their cannons. Death's angel struck not like an army but like inevitability itself, appearing in the cracks of their formation, cutting their rhythm, breaking their confidence, then vanishing into the haze before their bullets found him. Soldiers fired wildly into the smoke, their commanders roared in frustration, but no voice could drown the fear that seeped into every line. They had marched with the arrogance of numbers, but numbers meant nothing when each man feared that the shadow beside him might be his last breath. The villagers, hidden in the mountain paths, watched the battle unfold with hearts trembling. They had laid traps as he taught, rolling boulders onto columns, igniting brush fires that swallowed ammunition wagons, striking from above with stones and arrows when rifles failed. They were not soldiers, yet under his guidance they became a living wall, not seeking glory but survival. Their courage was born not of training but of desperation, for behind them stood their families, and behind their families stood nothing but the abyss of loss. And in front of them, moving with the certainty of the storm, was the figure they called Protector. Each time they saw him rise through the haze, their fear turned to flame, their trembling became steel, and they fought with the strength of those who believed in something greater than themselves. The enemy, though disciplined, began to fracture. Their lines twisted under the invisible weight of dread, their captains shouting louder with each passing hour, their signals lost in the chaos. They tried to press through the ridges, but the earth itself betrayed them, rocks tumbling, rivers rising, traps snapping shut with brutal precision. And within it all, they caught glimpses of him, the pale face streaked with dirt and blood, the black figure moving with the calm of inevitability. To some he was a curse made flesh, to others a ghost punishing them for the cruelty of their orders. Men who had marched with iron in their hearts now stumbled, their courage collapsing under the knowledge that they were not fighting an enemy, they were fighting their own fear. Yet though the legend towered above the battlefield, the man beneath it carried the weight of reality. His limbs ached with exhaustion, each breath sharp as glass, his wounds burning with every motion. His body, though honed by countless battles, was still mortal, and the tide of enemies seemed endless. Each strike drained him, each dodge carved deeper into his reserves, and in the moments between clashes, he felt the weight of silence pressing harder than the noise of war. But he could not allow himself to fall. Not while the villagers still looked to him. Not while their children, hidden in caves, clutched each other and whispered that death's angel would not let the darkness win. He was no angel, no phantom. He was flesh and blood, but he bore their hope as if it were a blade sharper than steel. The battle stretched into the night, neither side yielding, both consumed by desperation. Fires lit the ridges, casting twisted shadows across stone and smoke, and among them his figure became something more than human. He stood atop a fallen cart, his blade dripping with the silence of his foes, and in that moment 200 men faltered. They remembered the stories, the surrender, the eyes that had forced them to lay down their arms without a shout, and suddenly the field was not theirs. Panic rippled like fire in dry grass, spreading faster than any command could control. Soldiers turned, not toward the enemy but away from him, fleeing into the dark, their banners trampled under their own boots. What had begun as an army became a storm of broken wills, scattering across the valley, leaving behind the dead and the defeated. When silence finally returned, it was not the silence of victory but of exhaustion. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, their faces streaked with soot and tears, their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked upon the battlefield and saw not just bodies and broken weapons but the echo of something greater, something that felt like justice carved into the earth itself. And at the center of it stood the man who had carried them through fire, his shoulders slumped, his breath ragged, yet his gaze steady as ever. They moved toward him slowly, not with cheers or cries, but with quiet reverence, for they knew words could not measure what he had done. He looked back at them, his face unreadable, his silence deeper than any speech. For he knew this was not the end. Armies would return, stronger, angrier, desperate to crush not just the people but the legend that had humiliated them. He had not defeated the beast of war. He had only wounded it, and wounded beasts are the most dangerous. Yet for this night, he allowed himself to stand among the living, to breathe the same air as those he had protected, to share in the fragile hope that tomorrow might come. And when dawn broke, washing the valley in pale light, he was already gone. The villagers found only footprints leading into the mountains, vanishing into mist, as though he had never been there at all. But they knew better. They knew the legend was real because their hearts carried its fire. And somewhere beyond the ridges, Death's angel walked on, weary but unbroken, ready to face the storm again. The mountains carried his silence as he moved away from the valley, the echo of battle still lingering in his ears though the dawn had long risen. Behind him lay the ruins of an enemy force shattered not by numbers but by fear. Behind him lay villagers who whispered his name as if it were prayer, and yet ahead stretched only more shadows. Death's angel walked as though chased by the weight of the very legend he had become, for though his steps were steady, his soul bore the burden of every life lost and every voice that cried for him to save them. He knew the armies would not remain broken for long. They would regroup, their anger sharpened by humiliation, their pride demanding revenge. And when they returned, they would not come with hundreds but with thousands, their cruelty doubled, their resolve forged by shame. The war was not ending, it was only changing shape, and he could feel it pressing against the horizon like a storm gathering behind the ridges. His journey took him deeper into the mountains where rivers cut sharp scars into stone and forests whispered with winds older than memory. Here he found villages untouched by war, their people still clinging to fragile peace, unaware of how close the fire had come. They looked upon him with suspicion at first, for he arrived as a shadow among strangers, but the scars on his body and the quietness of his eyes soon silenced their doubts. Word of him had already reached them, carried by frightened deserters and hopeful survivors, and though some dismissed the tales as madness, the truth stood before them in flesh and bone. Children gathered in silence, their small eyes following his every move, elders bowed their heads with respect, and the young men looked to him as if he held the secrets of survival. He gave them no speeches, no promises of glory, only lessons carved in necessity. He showed them how to move without sound, how to vanish into the terrain, how to strike not for pride but for life. They listened, they learned, and in their hearts grew a strength they had not known they possessed. But the enemy was not idle. From the capital, orders spread like fire. The commanders had grown furious at the humiliation their armies had suffered, their names stained by whispers of surrender and defeat. They called upon reinforcements, entire battalions drawn from distant lands, mercenaries hungry for coin, cavalry trained to ride through forests, and even artillery prepared to tear mountains apart stone by stone. They were no longer hunting rebels or peasants. They were hunting him, the shadow that mocked their power, the phantom who turned armies into frightened children. They spoke his name with venom, branding him outlaw, demon, traitor to every crown, and placed a price on his head so vast that it tempted even the desperate and the dishonorable. Hunters began to stir, not for justice but for reward, men and women who would sell their souls for the promise of gold, all moving through the land with one purpose, to find Death's angel and break his legend. He felt the net tightening long before it reached him. Villagers carried news of strange men asking questions, of camps rising near trade roads, of forests filling with traps not laid by his hand. The world was closing around him, shrinking the places where he could breathe freely, forcing him to move with even greater care. Yet he did not retreat. Instead, he carried the fight deeper into the heart of the storm. He struck at convoys that brought supplies to enemy armies, ambushed messengers carrying orders, dismantled bridges before reinforcements could cross, and turned the very land into a labyrinth that swallowed his enemies. For every 100 they sent, perhaps 10 returned, and even they returned with eyes haunted by shadows they could not explain. His legend grew not by choice but by necessity, feeding on every clash, on every whisper, until even those who had never seen him began to doubt the safety of their own camps. Still he was human. His nights grew longer, his wounds slower to heal, his body burning with exhaustion that no rest could cure. Alone in the wilderness, he sometimes stared into rivers and saw not the phantom but the man beneath, the tired eyes, the hollow cheeks, the scars that marked not victory but survival. He wondered how long he could carry the weight, how long before his flesh betrayed him even if his will remained steel. But each time despair whispered, he remembered the faces of those he had saved, the children who laughed even in ruins, the elders who bowed in gratitude, the villagers who rebuilt their homes with trembling hands but unbroken spirits. Their hope became the fire that pushed him forward, the anchor that held him against the tide. One night, as he crossed a narrow pass, the enemy struck with precision that betrayed careful planning. Arrows rained from ridges, rifles cracked from hidden nests, and hunters closed in like wolves. For the first time he felt the weight of a trap designed not for soldiers but for him alone. He moved like water, flowing through their lines, his blade flashing, his feet dancing across stone, but for every enemy he struck down, two more rose in his path. The night echoed with shouts and gunfire, the mountains alive with the sound of pursuit. And yet, even surrounded, even outnumbered, he refused to yield. His body burned, his breath tore through his chest, but his spirit stood unbroken, for he knew the war was watching, the land was listening, and if he fell, the fire would dim in every heart that whispered his name. He cut his way through the pass, vanishing into the forests beyond, leaving behind a trail of silence and broken wills. The hunters, though many, did not pursue far, for even in near victory, fear gnawed at them. They had seen his eyes, steady as death itself, and they knew that though he was mortal, to face him was to stand against something greater than flesh. They whispered among themselves that no bounty was worth such terror, that no gold could pay for the weight of seeing death walk as a man. And so they left him, wounded but unbowed, free to move deeper into the war that had no end. The forest swallowed him in its shadows, its branches closing overhead like the arms of an ancient guardian. Each step he took was heavy, not from fear but from the weight of wounds hidden beneath his cloak, wounds that stung with every breath and every motion. The trap he had escaped in the pass had carved its price into his flesh, leaving cuts across his arms and bruises deep in his ribs, but still he moved forward, steady and relentless. The night creatures stirred around him, the cries of owls and the rustle of wolves, yet none dared to cross his path. He walked not as prey but as something older, something the wilderness itself seemed to respect. And though his blood left traces on the earth, he knew the forest would cover them, for even nature had grown weary of armies that scorched its soil. Death's angel carried on, his shadow unbroken even as his body faltered. Word of his survival spread faster than the enemy had hoped to contain. The hunters who had failed returned with trembling voices, speaking of how he slipped through their lines as though smoke itself had taken form, how his eyes pierced the dark with fire that no man could endure. Their commanders raged, furious at their failure, branding them cowards, yet deep inside the officers themselves, a doubt began to grow. They could not explain how one man continued to escape, how he broke armies apart, how fear followed him like a plague. Some whispered that perhaps he was no man at all, that the stories of Death's angel had birthed something supernatural, something no bullet could strike down. And though such whispers were punished, they could not be silenced, for fear is a seed that grows even in iron hearts. Meanwhile, in the villages scattered across the mountains, his legend had become more than rumor. Mothers spoke his name to quiet their children, not in fear but in comfort, as if his shadow alone could guard their sleep. Young men carved crude symbols of wings on their blades, saying they carried a fragment of his spirit into battle. Songs began to rise among the people, not of kings or empires, but of a silent figure who walked the ridges and turned despair into defiance. Yet with every song, with every whisper, the burden upon him grew heavier. For he knew he was no angel, no savior born of fire, but a man bleeding and breaking with every clash. Still he carried their hope, because to abandon it would be to abandon himself. The enemy shifted its strategy. No longer did they march blindly into the mountains. They began to move with patience, building outposts along rivers, placing spies within villages, spreading lies that Death's angel had abandoned the people, that he had fled into the wilderness and left them to their fate. They sought to poison the very faith that gave him strength, for they knew that legends thrived on belief, and if belief faltered, the fire would fade. But the people resisted, holding their silence, their eyes defiant, for they had seen enough to know truth from deception. Some even fed false information to the enemy, sending them into ambushes where shadows struck and vanished before they realized their mistake. The land itself had begun to rise against them, every villager a hidden ally, every mountain a watchtower, every forest a trap. And at the center of it all was the figure they followed, moving like a current beneath the surface, unseen yet always felt. One evening, as he rested by a stream, his reflection wavered in the water, fractured by ripples, and for the first time in many nights he allowed himself to stare. The face that looked back was gaunt, the eyes sunken but burning with relentless fire, the scars across his jaw and brow carving his story into flesh. He saw not an angel, not a phantom, but a weary man carrying the weight of too many battles. His chest ached, his hands trembled when he loosened his grip, and he wondered how long before his body refused to rise again. Yet even in that moment of weakness he knew there was no choice. To rest was to invite death not upon himself but upon every soul that trusted his shadow. And so he rose once more, washing the blood from his skin, binding his wounds with cloth torn from his cloak, and stepping again into the endless path that fate had carved for him. The next village he reached was already under siege. Fires burned at its edge, enemy soldiers pouring through its narrow streets, their shouts rising like thunder. Without hesitation he descended upon them, moving through smoke and chaos with a blade that sang its grim song. He struck with precision, each movement a line in a deadly script, and the tide of destruction shifted. Villagers who had been cornered found space to breathe, their courage flaring at the sight of him. Together they pushed back, stone and fire joining steel, and by night's end the attackers fled, leaving behind only ashes and shame. The villagers fell to their knees before him, but he lifted them up, telling them they were not saved by him alone but by their own strength, their own will to endure. They listened, but still they called him their angel, and he could not erase the fire in their eyes. As dawn came, the survivors gathered around him, asking where he would go next, asking if he would stay, asking if he could lead them into greater battles. He shook his head, his silence an answer deeper than words. He belonged to no one village, no one people. He belonged to the land, to the war itself, to the endless path that had chosen him. He left before the sun fully rose, vanishing once more into ridges and mist, his figure fading into the horizon. The villagers wept, not from sorrow, but from the strange knowledge that though he had left, his shadow would always linger, protecting them from the unseen edges of the world. And so he moved again, weary yet unbroken, carrying not just scars but the fire of every soul who believed in him. Ahead lay armies, hunters, traps, and betrayals yet unseen, but he did not slow. For the man they called Death's Angel had no place in peace, no rest in quiet valleys. His war was endless, his legend unstoppable, and though his heart longed for release, his path stretched on through the fire of destiny. The war stretched into a new season, the cold winds sweeping down from the mountains as if nature itself wished to cleanse the land of blood, yet the fires of battle only grew hotter. Death's Angel had become more than a story, he had become the enemy's obsession. The humiliation of broken armies and shattered pride had driven commanders into a frenzy, and from the distant cities they summoned not just soldiers but whole legions, armored columns and cavalry bred for war. They built camps fortified with steel and stone, training their men with one purpose alone, to end the shadow that mocked their power. His name was written on orders, whispered in war councils, carved into the rage of generals who could not bear the laughter of rivals at their failures. They no longer spoke of victory against villages or mountains, they spoke only of killing him, of crushing the legend, of burying Death's Angel so deep that no memory of him would remain. The land trembled beneath their preparations. Roads that once carried traders and shepherds now bore endless columns of troops, their boots pounding like thunder, their banners blotting out the horizon. Spies crept into villages, spreading fear, promising mercy to those who betrayed him, death to those who sheltered him. Rewards were offered so vast that hunger itself seemed to bow to gold. And still, amid this rising storm, the figure walked on, silent and unbroken. He moved through forests and valleys, through streams and cliffs, never lingering, never resting. Wherever he passed, hope flared, and wherever hope flared, resistance followed. Yet he felt the weight tightening around him, the noose of war drawing closer with each step. One night, as he stood upon a ridge overlooking a valley filled with enemy fires, he counted not hundreds but thousands. Their camps spread like a disease across the earth, their voices rising in songs of war, their cannons gleaming under moonlight. For a moment even he felt the enormity pressing upon him. No shadow, no matter how feared, could stand against such a tide. But his spirit did not waver. He understood the truth of war. Numbers did not win battles, will did. And though his body was only one, his shadow carried the weight of every soul that believed in him. He could not turn away. To vanish now would be to let the people's hope die, and that was a defeat worse than death itself. He began to move with greater cunning, striking not at armies but at their lifeblood. Convoys burned in the night, bridges collapsed beneath the weight of supply wagons, rivers carried away their stores, and messages vanished before they reached their commanders. Every step they took into the mountains was poisoned with uncertainty, every order disrupted by shadows they could not catch. The soldiers grew restless, their officers shouting louder with each delay, and always in their silence, they whispered the same name. Fear was a weapon sharper than any blade, and death's angel wielded it until even the strongest ranks began to tremble. But the enemy adapted. They began sending decoys, convoys laced with traps, patrols designed to lure him into ambushes. They studied the terrain as he did, turning the land into a labyrinth of dangers. Hunters returned, not as scattered individuals but as entire units trained to stalk him. He felt the shift, the pressure mounting, the margin for error shrinking with every move. His nights grew shorter, his body weaker, yet he pressed on, guided not by survival but by purpose. He struck only when certain, melted away when the odds grew too heavy, and always stayed one step ahead of the storm. But even he knew that the storm was closing. The villages too began to feel the weight of his legend. Some prospered under his shadow, rising in defiance, their courage burning brighter than fear. Others suffered for his presence, punished by enemy reprisals, their homes burned, their fields salted, their children scattered. He carried these scars as his own, for though he never sought to be their savior, he had become their shield, and every wound upon them cut deeper into him. In their eyes he was both blessing and curse, and he bore their love and their anger alike in silence. To them he was not a man but a symbol, and symbols could not falter, even if the man beneath the symbol longed for rest. One night, while moving through the ruins of a burned village, he found a survivor, a girl no older than 10, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with both terror and defiance. She stared at him as though unsure whether he was real, then whispered his name with trembling lips. He knelt beside her, his scarred hands gentle as he offered her water, and in her gaze he saw both the cruelty of the war and the reason he could not surrender to despair. She clung to his cloak, and though he wished to stay, he knew he could not. He left her in the care of hidden allies, vanishing once more into the shadows, carrying her voice with him as a vow that he would not fall while children still whispered his name with hope. The enemy's campaign grew relentless. They cut through forests, carved roads into the mountains, poured men and machines into the valleys. The land shook with their march, and yet they did not know that the very vastness of their strength was their weakness. For an army that stretched too far was an army that could be broken piece by piece. He watched from the ridges as they spread themselves thin, guarding every path, every stream, every imagined shadow. And he smiled, faint but real, for he understood that the larger the beast, the easier it was to bleed. And so the hunt entered its darkest hour. Thousands searched for him, hunters tracked every whisper, commanders sharpened their vengeance, yet he remained untouchable. Not because he was stronger but because he had become more than himself. He was not one man against thousands. He was every whisper of fear in their hearts, every shadow in their camps, every doubt that clawed at them when the night grew too silent. They could not catch him because he was not only flesh. He was legend, and legends cannot be hunted by steel alone. The final storm came without mercy. Across the horizon the enemy stretched like an unbroken wall, their banners black against the pale sky, their cannons wheeled into place, their legions filling the valleys with a roar that drowned even the wind. This was no longer a campaign of conquest but an execution, a war aimed at one man. Their generals had sworn to bury the shadow that mocked their strength, to erase the name whispered in fear and hope, to crush death's angel until only silence remained. They brought numbers greater than any he had ever faced, thousands upon thousands, with no path left open, no ridge unguarded, no stream unwatched. The land itself groaned under their march, and for the first time, even the mountains seemed small before the tide of steel and fire. Yet among them, unseen, he moved still, his steps deliberate, his silence unshaken, his will unbroken. He had known this moment would come. Legends do not fade gently, they end in fire. The villagers begged him not to face it, to vanish deeper into the wilderness, to let the war rage on without him. They told him the people already had his legend, that his survival mattered more than one last stand. But he only listened in silence, his eyes steady, his heart carrying a vow heavier than words. He was no king, no general, no chosen savior, yet he had become the shield between them and the abyss. If he fled, their hope would die, and hope once dead could not be reborn. And so he prepared not for victory but for the kind of battle that carves eternity into memory. He studied the terrain, marking ridges, rivers, and choke points, not with the arrogance of conquest but with the patience of one who understood that every hour bought with his resistance was life for those behind him. He armed villagers with what little they had, not promising survival but giving them the choice to stand. Many chose to stay, for they would rather fall in defiance than live as shadows under tyranny. When the first wave came, it rolled like thunder, drums beating, rifles flashing, cannons roaring. The mountains shook with their fury, but the ridges answered. Boulders tumbled onto marching columns, rivers swelled with sudden floods, fire leapt from the brush, and in the smoke moved a single figure. He struck at their flanks, vanished into mist, reappeared where they least expected, his blade a line of light against the storm. Soldiers who had never seen him before froze in terror when his shadow cut through their lines, for he was not one man in their eyes but the weight of every rumor, every nightmare, every whisper that had kept them awake in their tents. Fear cracked their formations, and where fear spread, chaos followed. Yet for every line he broke, another rose, for the tide was endless, and he was only one against thousands. The battle raged for hours that stretched into days. The villagers fought beside him, their courage a flame that refused to die, but their numbers dwindled, their strength burned by the ceaseless onslaught. The ridges became graveyards, the rivers ran dark, and still the enemy came. He moved among them like fire refusing to be extinguished, his body bleeding, his breath ragged, yet his eyes still burning with the same calm flame. Arrows pierced his side, blades cut his arms, bullets tore through his cloak, but none of it slowed him. Pain was nothing before the weight of what he carried. He knew each moment he stood was another moment children could escape, another moment the wounded could flee deeper into the mountains, another moment hope could live. His legend was no longer just a shadow. It was the lifeline of a people, and he bore it with a strength beyond flesh. At last the enemy brought their full fury. Cannons thundered until the ridges collapsed, fire rained from the skies, soldiers surged in endless waves, their shouts shaking the heavens. The villagers were scattered, their homes burned, their cries piercing the smoke, and at the center of it all stood the figure they sought. He did not hide, did not flee, but rose from the ruins like a flame that refused to die. Surrounded on all sides, his blade shone one final time, carving through steel and fear alike. Soldiers fell not from his strength but from their terror of him, and in their fear they fired blindly, striking even their own. Chaos swallowed the valley, and in the chaos, his shadow loomed larger than life. They said later that he moved faster than the eye could follow, that fire bent away from him, that death itself hesitated to claim him. But legends are born in moments when truth and memory blur, and in that moment he became more than man. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield lay in ruins. Thousands of soldiers stood silent, their banners torn, their formations broken. At their center, surrounded by bodies and fire, his figure finally knelt, his blade buried in the earth, his cloak torn to shreds. His breath was shallow, his blood soaking the soil, yet his eyes still burned with defiance. The soldiers, though victorious in numbers, did not cheer, for they felt no triumph in what they had done. They had not killed a man, they had tried to kill a legend, and in their hearts they knew legends do not die so easily. As his body sank into silence, their fear did not fade, it grew, for they realized that his death would only carve his story deeper into eternity. And so it was. The villagers who survived carried his name across mountains and valleys, across rivers and cities, until even distant lands whispered of the one who stood against armies and made 200 men surrender without a fight. Soldiers who had faced him spoke of his eyes in hushed voices, their courage broken not by his blade but by his presence. Children grew into adults hearing his story, carving his memory into songs, into stone, into the very soul of the land. He had fallen, but in his fall he had risen beyond reach. For Death's angel was never just one man. He was the defiance of the weak, the fire of the forgotten, the breath of hope that no army could crush. And though his body lay in the earth, his shadow walked on. In every whisper of rebellion, in every act of courage, in every heart that refused to bow, he lived. For legends do not die in silence, they live forever in the echoes of those who believe. The end.